All right, good evening once again. Thank you guys so much for joining. This is Brooke from WorldTeach here in the U.S. office in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So super excited to be here tonight to discuss our program in Chile, which is departing this February. Very much looking forward to speaking with our panelists that are on the line. So just to tell you a bit about the listeners that we have with us, we have some new applicants, also those that have just been accepted into the program, and a few others that are just interested in learning more about WorldTeach and specifically our program in Chile. And as I mentioned before, we have some panelists joining us for the evening, recent alumni and field staff. So thank you guys so much for joining us. Let's do this. Okay, here's our agenda. So first, we're going to spend a couple minutes meeting our panelists and learning a bit about their backgrounds. Then we'll get into the specifics of our Chile program, including our partnership with the Fundación Educacional Oportunidad, why there's a need for our volunteers there, the support that's provided for our volunteers, including funding from our partner, and also the remaining volunteer fee and what that covers. From there, we're going to talk about being in the classroom, which is, of course, the reason why we are going to Chile in the first place. So how are the teaching placements made, and when will you receive them? What sort of cultural challenges will you encounter in the classroom? What sort of resources will you have or won't you have? Most importantly, we're going to actually get our feedback from, people that were there to tell you about their personal experiences. So after that, we'll talk about living in Chile because, yes, while we are going there to work and to teach, this is your daily life. This is everything. This is not just a trip. This is not just vacation. This is the morning, the afternoon, and the evening every day. So, what are the housing placements like? Who are you going to be living with? What is the monthly stipend? And of course, the major question, is it enough to live off of? What activities do people get involved with outside of the classroom? And again, we'll get to hear personal experiences from our alumni. After that, we're going to quickly address the volunteer qualifications that we're looking for and the application itself. Also, we'll be dedicating a bit of time to Q&A with our panelists. So again, you can feel free to chat in questions. We will try to address them as they come in, but depending if it's relevant to everybody, we will save it for the end to address as a group. So let's get started. Thanks, guys. Okay, so that's me, Brooke. That's a picture of me with my sixth graders in Colombia, where I was a volunteer with WorldTeach just last year. Before that, I was working in corporate America, which definitely has its ups and definitely has its downs. And I was looking to get abroad, get some teaching experience, learn Spanish. I spent about 2 years doing some Google research and sitting on my WorldTeach application. I finally just said, all right, I got to do this, sent it in, and I moved to Colombia. And here I am now working for the organization because it kind of changed everything. So more importantly, let's move on to our panelists. Heather, our WorldTeach Chile program manager. Heather, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, my name is Heather, like Brooke said, and I currently work at WorldTeach headquarters as program manager. Previously, I was in Chile for 2 years, first as a volunteer and then as field director. And I've been all over the place since I graduated from college, as you can see, from Japan to New Zealand and everywhere in between. But I'm excited to be here to talk about Chile.
Fantastic. And so, question, Heather, do you remember how you first came about finding WorldTeach, why you decided to join, and why specifically Chile?
Yeah, I was kind of looking to go abroad again after I came back from Japan, and I definitely wanted to teach and see if I would be interested in doing that long term. I also wanted to do it out of the country and also learn Spanish. So obviously I looked into South America and just Googled some programs and some opportunities, and WorldTeach came up. And it just seemed like the most comprehensive program I could find. And the timing was right, and so I just went for it there.
Nice. Yes, Google is definitely our friend, but of course everybody's got to do their research and, be able to vet programs and all that. So very cool. Okay, thank you, Heather. We're going to go on to Laura. Laura, I think I'm going to pronounce your name correctly, hopefully. Laura Zaccanino?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So one of our alums from Chile. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Laura. I actually just got back from Chile, I guess about 9 months ago. I was in the Elqui Valley. I was teaching in the schools there. So any questions you have about the area or what the schools are like, you can definitely direct to me. Like the bio says, I currently live in DC and I work in research and education. And I was attracted to WorldTeach and Chile specifically because my background was in Latin America, and I really wanted to get inside of a public school classroom in Latin America, and WorldTeach allowed me to do that. So yeah, that's how I got to Chile.
Very cool. And Laura, had you actually taught in like a formal classroom setting before going to Chile?
I was an SAT tutor, so it was definitely different in Chile because I wasn't in a formal classroom there, and also that was in the U.S., but I did have that sort of tutoring teaching experience.
Cool. And how was your Spanish before you left for Chile?
My Spanish was okay. Definitely relied on Google Translate a lot. So that was one of the other reasons I wanted to go. I really wanted to develop my speaking capabilities specifically. So definitely was awesome for that.
Yeah, I was going to say, how's your Spanish now?
It's better. I'm still working on it. I'm a bit rusty, so.
Bueno, vamos a practicar.
Yeah, necesito practicar más.
Ay, yo también. Bueno. Yeah, there's a lot of Spanish speaking in our office. Thank God, Heather. Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Laura. So we're going to go on. Okay, this slide is very important because I want everybody to understand that WorldTeach is only working in countries that have specifically invited us. So for example, in Chile, we have been there for over 10 years now, actually. And we're entering our third year of partnership with a Chilean nonprofit, the Fundación Educacional Oportunidad. So I want to have Heather address this because, as she mentioned, she was the field director there a couple years ago, so she was actually very important in setting up this partnership. So again, we have been invited by specific partners. They're the ones that recognize the need for, in this case, English teachers in a very certain area. And so we're only going to these places where they have already self-identified the need and therefore are helping fund this whole program. So Heather, is there anything you could address on like the relationship between WorldTeach and the Fundación, or kind of in general why you think there's a need for our volunteers specifically in the Elqui Valley?
Sure. So in 2011, I closed out the program in Chile that used to be there for many years, since it started in 2003. And so I was approached by the foundation and asked about our organization. They had heard about us through the David Rockefeller Latin American Studies Center at Harvard University. They have an office in Santiago. And they set up a meeting with us or set up a meeting with me to kind of see what we did and see if we were the right fit for what they were looking for in the programs they were running. The program being the current one that they have in the Elqui Valley. And so what they do, and I'm sure Laura can speak to this because she experienced this program in particular, they do a lot of activities in English and run a lot of events and a lot of competitions outside of what they already do in the classroom. And so the need for a native English speaker in these classrooms and in these competitions, helping the kids kind of learn and prepare for them, was a high priority for them. And so we figured out that the partnership would work in that way, and it kind of went from there, and that's where we are today.
Fantastic. And how about the Elqui Valley? Like, obviously, we know that a place like Santiago, I mean, is probably, or just Chile in general, is the strongest economy in Latin America right now. But so then, why are we in the Elqui Valley?
In the Elqui Valley, it's a bit more remote than other parts of Chile. It's on the inside, away from the coast, and kind of surrounded by hills and mountains, and so the students there get less exposure to proper English instruction. However, they do get a lot of exposure to English because it's a high tourism area during the summertime especially, and so them learning English opens up a lot of doors for them to get jobs in tourism or move on to get better paying jobs in the cities in Chile and outside of Chile.
Awesome. All right, fantastic. Thank you so much for explaining that. And let's take a moment to look at this picture in the middle, Mr. Ari, with the vocabulary words on his face. I think that is fabulous and shows true dedication to becoming immersed into the classroom. So I love that picture. All right, we're going to continue. Another very important slide and topic of conversation is the support for the volunteer and therefore the volunteer fee. So as we were just discussing, the Fundación, they're the ones that have invited us to Chile, and therefore they're the ones that provide the majority of the funding. So it costs on average about $10,000 per volunteer to fund the volunteer for the year, and that's including that whole long list there. So your visa, housing, monthly stipend, like health insurance, training, all of that stuff. So clearly we don't get all of that $10,000 from the Fundación. Unfortunately, they're only able to give us as much as they can, and as we had just mentioned, it's a nonprofit. So we're still pretty excited to get the money that we do from them. But so that does leave a remainder, which as you see right there is that $3,590. And so that is the volunteer fee. So it's, it's a straight fact that this program is pretty expensive. And so for that, our volunteers do tons of fundraising. We actually, WorldTeach can get you in touch with alumni that have been very successful with fundraising. We can give you, advice, pointers, so that you can raise this money. We've had alumni raise this money and more. I personally have a friend who raised enough money that she ended up having additional leftover after the volunteer fee and bought a computer to donate to the school that she was working at. So it's absolutely possible. You just have to dedicate yourself. So again, as you can see here, the main things it's covering and that WorldTeach is supporting for you is your visa, housing, monthly stipend, field support, all of that stuff. So we're going to get more into the actual like training support that we provide you, but it's very important to look at this list to see, so that you see where this money is going towards. Okay, again, if anyone has any questions, just feel free to chat them in. But at this point, we're going to continue. Okay. We're getting to another opportunity for our panelists to share their stories. So, okay, teaching in Chile. Again, this is the reason why we're all going there. So I'm sure many of you are thinking, like, I've never taught before. How am I supposed to do this? I don't speak Spanish. How am I supposed to communicate with these people? So obviously, first of all, it's English only in the classroom. So if you don't know Spanish, that is okay, and it will actually probably help you at the beginning. Okay, so because we are not sending trained teachers, our orientation training is very, very important for us. We take it very seriously. So that orientation is about a month, sometimes 3 to 4 weeks when you first get to the country. So this is happening in country. You're going to have extensive teacher training sessions every day. And then you'll also be having language immersion classes every day. So those first that month is long. Those days are long, but they're extremely satisfying because you're gaining the skills you need and the confidence you need to then go to the classroom, be your own person, be your own boss, and make it happen. And of course, there are going to be moments that are up and down, but that's why you really need to pay attention during orientation. Also during orientation, we do an actual teaching practicum. So you'll have a few days where you're teaching in the classroom while you're still with your field staff and fellow volunteers, so that you guys can kind of help each other through it, because yes, it's definitely overwhelming, even for people that have taught before, because all of a sudden you're in a completely different environment, different classroom, with different resources, different students, etc. So also during that orientation, we do a lot of like safety briefing, health and security, that sort of thing. So additional support for the teaching aspect, because again, we're not trained teachers, the majority of us anyways. So our volunteers will receive a curriculum that has been designed specifically for Chile. So, you know, looking at the Ministry of Education, like what are they teaching, what is relevant, what is culturally relevant, and what is the priority in Chile for the certain grades that we're working with. So all of our volunteers will receive that. It's then up to them, of course, whether they want to use it in their classes or not, but it's definitely a good supplement to have. Most of the schools we work at in Chile, I would think, do have existing curriculums. Heather, would you agree that they do have existing curriculums?
They do.
Yeah.
For the most part, yes.
Okay, cool. That's a benefit. I mean, that's a huge luxury, as we know. A lot of the countries that WorldTeach works in, the schools, many schools anyways, do not have an existing curriculum. So this will just kind of aid you with that. All right, fantastic. And then also the last point on teacher training and teaching like professional development is that every volunteer is assigned a teacher quality coordinator who is here in my office here in the States, and you're in touch with them monthly to review lesson plans and assessments and to provide you with those additional resources, whether it's like actual lesson plan ideas or games or just, you know, teaching materials that you might not be aware of that that our coordinators can provide you with. So that is kind of a brief intro for our teaching support, if you will. You'll also be, you know, in contact with your field director every week, and so they're also another system of support for you, and they come check you out in the school, etc. But I want to get to the panelists. So Heather, since you were overseeing all of the volunteers and therefore visiting their schools in general, what sort of resources are most classrooms equipped with or lacking?
So it really varies from school to school, or varied at that time. And if the volunteer was able to work in their own classroom, they usually had some kind of board, whether it be a chalkboard or a blackboard or a whiteboard, and kind of just normal school supplies like paper and markers and crayons. A lot of the students have a lot of their own supplies that they're required to bring, and so there wasn't a lot of that the volunteer needed to bring. But in terms of creating activities and games and whatnot, sometimes the school would have things like colored paper and scissors and glue, or sometimes the volunteer would have to get that themselves.
Okay, cool. So fairly well resourced, actually, in comparison to a lot of areas. Would you be able to have something like internet on school grounds, like if you wanted to play music for people or something like that?
So I would like to defer this question to Laura eventually, but because she knows best about the Elqui Valley and specifically, but the classrooms that I saw when I was down there, the majority had internet. They all had Wi-Fi, and many of the schools had projectors and some laptops and computers that they were able to use.
Okay, cool. All right, fantastic. So yeah, on that point, then let's actually get right to Laura. So Laura, we would love to hear about where you were teaching, like what the class size was, and who you were teaching, and definitely I believe you were probably working at a couple different schools, so if you can talk about that, because as our volunteers or as our applicants are just going to start learning, a lot of our volunteers in Chile actually work at numerous schools. So if you could explain kind of how the logistics worked behind that as well.
Sure. So let's see. I was in the Elqui Valley, which is where the program is going to be out of. So I was teaching in two primary schools. I taught kindergarten through 8th grade in two different schools, so it was definitely a very large range. I probably had about 10 or 11 classes in total, so definitely got to know a lot of students. Just to answer the question about resources in the Elqui Valley, it is pretty rural, so most schools don't have Wi-Fi, but teachers I worked with had a band that allowed them to connect to the internet, so we could access internet materials, and we did have projectors, which was very helpful. What we didn't have was the ability to print a lot of materials, so we would have to create something to put on the projector rather than giving out worksheets, which made it a little difficult at times, but overall I would say the classrooms were pretty similar to what Heather described.
Cool.
Yeah, so sorry, what were the other questions?
It's okay. I definitely threw a lot at you. So if you were working at two schools, then how would you get to each school?
Right. So one of the schools I worked at was actually a few blocks away from where I lived, so I would just walk there in the morning. And then the other school I had to take a bus to. It was a few miles away, but there's a public bus system in the Elqui Valley, so that's not a problem. The buses don't really have a schedule, so as I'm sure we'll talk about later, you have to be flexible. But it was a short bus ride. The buses are not too expensive, so transportation was never an issue there.
So would you spend, let's say, like 2 days a week at one school, 3 days a week at another, or how did that work?
Yeah, I would spend 3 days a week at this school that was a few blocks from where I lived in Paiwano, and then I would spend 2 days a week at another school a few miles away in a town called Rivadavia.
Okay,
And
cool.
I worked with 3 different co-teachers who were Chilean. I worked with one in my first school that I was at 3 days a week, and then in the other school I would actually work with one teacher on Mondays, and then I would work with another teacher on Thursdays.
Okay, so were you always co-teaching, or did you have some independent classes?
I was normally co-teaching. How the Fundación has the program set up is so that volunteers are normally with Chilean English teachers. However, one of the schools I was in, one of the teachers was not an English teacher. She knew a little bit of English, but not that much. So on the days I was with her, I would take over more of the classroom activities, but she was still in the room, to deal with any discipline issues or kind of guide the curriculum still.
Mm-hmm. And so for lesson planning, would you do that alongside the co-teacher?
Yeah, I think that really varied. I feel like from talking to the other volunteers, everyone had a different relationship with their co-teachers, and I know just for me, between the 3 teachers I worked with, it was a very kind of different relationship with each.
Mm-hmm.
With one of my teachers, she liked to plan things more herself, and we definitely talked about what activities I would do, but she would be the one more responsible for planning the lessons of the day and kind of telling me what activities I could help with or where I could incorporate my mini lesson. And then with some of the other teachers in the other school, I had more freedom to give my ideas and kind of plan the class a little bit more. But you are definitely following a curriculum, so you're not responsible for, planning the entire semester or anything like that.
Great. And how would you say was the level of English for the Chilean English teachers?
Yeah, the two teachers that I worked with who were actually English teachers had really great levels of English. We didn't have any trouble understanding each other generally. The thing about the Fundación is part of their work is to recruit really good English teachers. So the Fundación teacher I worked with had a really great level of English and had been to Australia. So I think that's really a priority from working with the Fundación, which definitely makes our job easier.
Absolutely. I mean, in Colombia, I was co-teaching with Colombian English teachers, and their English was not so great. So it sounds like there are a lot of blessings down in Chile. Okay, another question for you, Laura. Cultural challenges in the school, with the administration, with the other teachers, in the classroom, students, anything that you were, kind of shocked by at the beginning, or that was kind of just difficult to accustom to?
I would say that the two biggest things about Chile is the schedule isn't as set as the United States, and especially in the schools I was teaching at, things could change last minute. They don't really have substitute teachers, so sometimes my co-teacher, and I would have to cover another class, which obviously took time away from lesson planning. So that's just kind of one of those things you have to realize going into it, and you just have to kind of be flexible with it. And then the second thing was discipline is, well, it's a little different in Chile, especially in the Elqui Valley. Discipline is a little more lax, so that was more of a problem in one of the schools I was in, and the other one it wasn't as much of a problem, so I guess it also just depends where you are. So yeah, that also was just a problem with certain classes. It wasn't everyone, but that's why it's so nice to have a Chilean co-teacher in the classroom with you, because honestly, they were usually the ones that dealt with the discipline issues rather than me having to deal with that alone.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Heather, I know you did a bit of co-teaching, and you also did a bit of independent teaching. I don't know if you want to add anything from your own personal experience, maybe from like cultural challenges that you faced, or just, the challenge that co-teaching can sometimes be.
Yeah, so Laura touched on the main things that I probably would have listed first as well. And I thought, so the first semester that I was teaching there as a volunteer, I was in my own classroom, and what we did was the classes were 90 minutes each, and there were about 30 to 40 to 45 kids in each class. And so what my co-teacher and I did was split them in half, and I would take half of 45 minutes, and she would take the other half of 45, and then I would work on listening and speaking activities, and she would do the curriculum from the book in reading and writing. And then at the halfway point, we would switch. And that worked for a while. It was the discipline and the behavior management was definitely the biggest challenge in that, because I had the classroom to myself, and the way that the kids behave in classrooms is very different from anything I'd ever seen teaching in the States and in Japan. And so it was kind of a reality check for me. And I also didn't have a real classroom. They just put me where there was space, because they didn't have an extra room to give up. And so I was actually put in the auditorium stage, and I could close the curtain, so it was a closed off space, but there's just stuff everywhere, like a piano and some bleachers in the back, and so kids obviously would love to run around and play with that, and also the curtains themselves were
a distraction.
A distraction themselves, so they go hide in them. So it was definitely a challenge trying to deal with that, and it worked for a while, but then it just didn't work anymore at some point. And so halfway through the year, I talked to my co-teacher to try to figure out a better way to be able to manage them, and we decided to try co-teaching. And like Laura said, with the Chilean teacher in the room with you while you're teaching, it makes it a lot easier for disciplining the kids who are misbehaving, or just kind of keeping an overall manageable level. And so that worked out for the rest of the year.
Awesome. Cool. Okay, great. It's nice to have both perspectives from both different experiences. Okay, cool. One final note on teaching. So our volunteers are full-time teachers. So you're usually in the classroom for about 20 to 25 hours a week. But then, of course, there's additional time needed for lesson planning, and sometimes you can get pulled into other events or activities on campus, which I think is obviously a good thing. And that's a great opportunity to become part of the community. But so, again, you're full-time, so you could be on school grounds for essentially those 40 hours per week. And so when school is in session, you're in session, and when school's on vacation, you're on vacation. So again, we are full-time teachers. We take that responsibility very seriously. So we'll be able to talk about like what you do during vacation or what you do during your free time briefly, but just wanted to point that out for that time commitment. And again, lesson planning is obviously something very, very vital. And so as as Laura was saying, you could be lesson planning with your co-teacher. You could be doing things on your own, so you have to take that into account. All right, fantastic. We're going to go on to the next slide, which is just as important, living in Chile, your life in Chile. So, okay. First of all, placements. This is a little unique because right now with our program in Chile, all of our volunteers are going to be in one region, that is the Elqui Valley. So it's not like there's going to be a huge variety. In some countries, we place people all over the country. That could be a major city or it could be a super rural pueblo. But this is different. Chile, it's all fairly the same area, and we're working at primary and secondary schools. So your placement isn't really going to be a surprise, which is a nice thing because for me personally, when I went to Colombia, I had no idea who I would be teaching nor where. So this definitely takes out a bit of that ambiguity that a lot of our volunteers feel at the beginning. But so if and when you are accepted, you'll fill out a volunteer profile form. And that's where you list your preferences as to like what age students you want to teach, what sort of environment you want to live in regarding a host family, if you prefer to live and work near other volunteers or further away. And so then based off of your preferences and also your experience, the field director will place you accordingly to where he or she thinks you'll be the most successful. And I think sometimes it's not always where you want to be or where you picture yourself being, but then you quickly realize it's where you're supposed to be, like whether it's because of the school you were placed at or the specific teachers that you're working with that needed, extra help or the family that you're living with. So I think it definitely comes to fruition and you find yourself where you're supposed to be. So you will get this placement usually just a couple weeks before departing for Chile. And as I said, you already know that you're going to be in a rural region, and so therefore it's not too much surprise. And volunteers won't be too far away from each other because we're all in one area. So all of our volunteers will be with host families, though of course the definition of that family could differ. For example, it could be, a couple with or without children. It could be like a Chilean roommate / landlord, if you will. Like it could be one person versus a couple. So you definitely have to be flexible in that. And I think if you put effort into that placement, you can create a family. But it definitely requires work. Some volunteers can be placed together. And other volunteers can be placed on their own. So you might be literally living with another volunteer or be the only volunteer in that house. So Laura, let's start with you. Can you tell us about your housing situation? So who you lived with, what amenities you had, what meals you were provided by your host family?
Sure. Well, I think I got very lucky in the host family respect. I was living with a woman who was the equivalent of a vice principal in one of the schools that I didn't teach at, but some of the other WorldTeach volunteers were at. And yeah, she was great. I loved living with her. I was usually provided with 3 meals a day, but that being said, breakfast and dinner was usually kind of just bread or tea, like something pretty simple, and then lunch is the larger meal of the day. So I was provided with like a American type dinner for that. And yeah, I was placed on my own, so I wasn't living with another volunteer. But as Brooke mentioned, everyone is within a pretty short distance of each other, which really attracted me to the program. So it's not like you're just going to be completely isolated on your own. The current WorldTeach lead teacher lived in the same town as me, and I was able to walk to her house. And the other 2 volunteers lived in a town that was about a 20-minute bus ride away. So it was definitely accessible in that way.
Cool, awesome. Yeah, it's good to note that this is a small program. We only have requests for 6 volunteers this year, so obviously it makes the program a bit more competitive because it is so small. So yeah, it's definitely attracting a certain person that, you know, you obviously have a lot of independence because you're the only volunteer in your school, and you're the only volunteer in your house, in this case, Laura, but at the same time you do have that support system from other volunteers, so you get a bit of both. Okay, fantastic. So how about Heather, question for you. When you were a field director, obviously overseeing all of the volunteers, and also just from your own experience, what did most people struggle with in terms of their housing placement? Because obviously we know it could be difficult at times.
Yeah, so with each house and each family, so much can vary, and each volunteer is also different and unique, and so some would struggle with maybe being able to communicate what they wanted, or setting boundaries. For example, Chilean mothers are very attentive, at least the majority of them, and so they would often go into their rooms and clean them and sometimes do their laundry for them, and the volunteer just kind of either has to accept it and let them go with it, or they would have to say something. And the ones who struggled more were the ones who had an issue with that or something else and didn't know how to communicate it or didn't want to, and just kind of let it sit pent up and let things build up. So that was a struggle that some volunteers went through, that they would communicate to me, and I would help them try to figure out the best way to go about communicating it. And yeah, other things communication is probably the biggest issue that comes up, whether it be because the Spanish level was low, or they're just afraid to say anything or didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings. But in the end, the open communication always helps.
Mm-hmm. I think that intercultural communication that people end up taking away after the year ends is probably the biggest benefit of this whole experience. I mean, I was just at the University of Pennsylvania, and they literally have a program in their Masters of Education school, or excuse me, their Graduate School of Education, titled Intercultural Communication. Like, how dare you have to go to school for that when this is actually what you can do in real life? So once you learn to communicate with these people, whether it's in the workforce or in your home, I think that is what creates success for you in your future, and enables you to learn how to understand people from a different background and a different language, and to make them understand you and your needs. So yes, absolutely a struggle for everybody, but if you can overcome it, and when you overcome it, that is when the true learning takes place, I think. Okay, great. Thank you guys so much. So next question, Laura. So can you tell us about like what you did in your free time, what you did during the weekends, you know, if you had a chance to travel, if you had vacation time, like what did you do to become part of the community, to make a life for yourself there and not just a job?
Sure. Well, the first thing I would say is the Elqui Valley is very rural. So if you're used to living in a city, or most places in the U.S., life will be very different. The pace is much slower there. So if you're not into living somewhere rural, then it's probably not the placement you'd be most happy in. But at the same time, the area is gorgeous. I really enjoyed living there. It is like a tight-knit community sort of feel, so if you want to, you can definitely get to know a lot of people, both inside the schools and through your host family, and just, I don't know, through other community events, which is very nice. Let's see. So in my free time, I did have a lot of time to myself because I was kind of living alone. So normally I would just come back from school. Sometimes I would have to do some work planning lessons if I didn't finish that during the school day. I would usually eat dinner or more tea and bread, because that's what they eat at night, with my host family. And then I would usually just kind of read in my room or watch TV or something like that during the week. And sometimes I would see the other WorldTeach volunteer that lived in my town, which was very nice to have somebody so close. With the group on the weekends, we would normally have a bonfire at one of the volunteers' houses. That was a favorite activity of ours.
Oh my God, that's awesome.
Yeah, look at the stars. I mean, there's definitely some perks to living in the Elqui Valley. So, like I said, I loved it. So I feel like it's a really amazing place to live, and somewhere that you would never have the opportunity to live in your life otherwise, probably. So I thought, you know, being somewhere so different than a city was great, at least for me. And then there would sometimes be kind of local dances. There's a thing in Chile called Fiestas Patrias, which is a week-long Independence Day celebration. So there's a ton of kind of dances and just get-togethers both in the school and outside the school. So they'll have that sometimes. Also during the week, we had adult classes twice a week, and this was just something that the WorldTeach volunteers had organized. So it wasn't by any means a requirement, it was just something additional that we did. And I actually really loved that, just because all of the people there were there voluntarily. So they were all really excited to learn English, and I don't know, we just could do a lot of fun activities with them. So that was another way that we were able to meet some more people in the community.
That's fantastic. It's really cool. Did you travel outside of the Elqui Valley at all?
Yeah, I did. So yeah, Chile is an amazing country, really gorgeous geography, going from the desert to Patagonia. I didn't go all the way to the desert in Patagonia, but I went somewhere in between. So there's a 2-week vacation in July. So during that time, me and another WorldTeach volunteer traveled to a city called Valparaiso, which is close to Santiago, and also to the Pucón area, which is kind of filled with volcanoes and lakes and beautiful nature and stuff like that. And then the other thing is, even though the Elqui Valley is, like I said, very rural and kind of isolated, there is a city 2 hours away by bus called La Serena, which is on the ocean. So I generally go there maybe once every 2 months, but I know some people would go there, you know, a lot more often because it's not that far. So that's nice to have, because you can, you know, get peanut butter there, just sushi, or like, you know, kind of U.S. food, which is definitely nice to have, or kind of go to a restaurant or feel like you're more in a city environment.
Awesome. You bring us to a good point, actually, because you're talking about sushi and restaurants, and
Yeah.
that, of course, brings us to money. So with that approximate $200 stipend, how did you do with that? And, like, could you speak to the cost of living in the Elqui Valley?
Sure. Yeah, so the Elqui Valley is pretty inexpensive. Chile is more expensive than other parts of Latin America, but within the Elqui Valley, there's really not that much that you could be spending the money on, because you have meals generally provided through your host family, or at least I did. It's not like you have all of these living expenses you really need to be spending money on. I was fine with money. I actually had money left over to use for traveling, which was great, but I think it probably depends on the person. I did consciously kind of save my money for that because I knew I wanted to spend it on traveling.
Mm-hmm.
But I think if you wanted to go into La Serena, every weekend or spend your money elsewhere, then, it might be tougher to have money left over or you might need to spend some of your own money to do that. But I felt like I was perfectly comfortable with the amount I had.
Okay, great. Heather, could you maybe speak to that too for like your own self or for the volunteers, like how most people felt with the stipend?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit. I can give specific examples of some of my friends and some of the volunteers and their situations. So personally, when I was a volunteer, I went down and I had worked before and saved up before I went down to Chile, so I had some money to spend on travel and a little bit extra. And some volunteers also do that. Some of my friends did that down there. There were also ones who went down and had to kind of just get by on what they had because they didn't have the savings going down. They were all able to live comfortably with the stipend they're provided, and with their host families, they never had a problem with that. But in terms of lifestyle, it depends on what you have going down and how you live your life down there in order to kind of do things you want to do, for example, traveling or eating out. And so, yeah, it's so variable
Mm-hmm.
depending on the person that it's a wide range of activities that you could or might not do.
Yeah, but for basic living, which again, this is a living stipend, so for basic living, it's going to be
For basic living, it
enough.
is, yes, it's definitely enough to, if you have to take the bus to school every day or buy a snack during school or in the afternoon or have to get your own dinner, it covers all of that.
Okay, fantastic. Awesome. All right. For now, I think this is good for living in Chile. If anybody has any questions on this, please type them in. We're going to go on to the next slide, which isn't nearly as exciting, but it is relevant. Okay, so the application process and what we're looking for in our volunteers. So applicants for our year-long program, like Chile, for example, they have to be native English speakers, though they could be from any country, and hold a bachelor's degree. You do not have to have, formal teaching experience, as we talked about at the beginning of the webinar. For example, Laura, you had done some tutoring, but we do not require that you have teaching experience. However, definitely a commitment to, service and that learning process and a flexible attitude. I think that's something that we've kind of shown throughout this. Those are all musts for sure. You don't need to know Spanish, so it's not going to hurt or help your application. So here are the required items for the application, which are all on our website as well. And then the process concludes with a phone or a Skype interview with our admissions coordinator, who actually lived in Chile for quite some time, and she would be on Skype on this call with us right now if unfortunately she wasn't at home sick. So that's Caitlin, for those of you listening who have already been working with her. She is very, very passionate about this program, so she's excited to work with people through the application process. We are accepting applications until December 1st. However, it is rolling admissions, so I believe that could mean that the program will close before the 1st because we already have most people confirmed, and as we noted, it is a very small program. Also, as it says here, the decision is made 2 to 3 weeks after the application is complete. So you'll know fairly quickly, and then our volunteers will be departing in February and returning in December. So it's not even a full year program, about 10 months, but definitely enough time to become, part of the country, part of the culture, part of the classroom, to wake up and all of a sudden have had a dream in Spanish and be like, oh my God, now I live here. Like now this is real life. Okay, so we're going to go past this into, we have a few minutes left for questions. So if anybody has any questions, please text them in. But in the meantime, let's see, we have talked about things like bringing savings, Spanish knowledge prior to arrival, vacation. Here's a question that I often get from people. So actually, this isn't necessarily directed to the panelists, but people often ask about like the average age of the volunteer because we mentioned a lot of things about, you know, bachelor's degree and whatnot. So it's kind of assumed that the majority of our volunteers are straight out of college, and that is fairly accurate. However, we send volunteers up into their 70s, and I recently was speaking with an applicant today who is 62 years old and retired, and he was concerned that someone of his age would face, you know, would have more difficulties or be maybe not as well received by the community. And I just have to say I completely disagree. I think an older volunteer has a lot to bring to the table that perhaps a younger person doesn't, whether in the classroom or outside of the classroom. So I think it's absolutely what you put forward into your new community that you will then receive back. You know, these people are very eager to have us. They are literally paying for us to be there. And as Laura was saying, you know, you have so many opportunities to become part of the community and to meet people. So regardless of your age, regardless of your background, whether you studied education or not, it's all about your personal desire to take on a challenge like this. You know, whether it's you want to try teaching or whether it's you want to become part of this, you know, Latin culture that I think all of us on the line are very in love with. And, you know, perhaps you have these other passions or backgrounds that you can then bring to the community. So a lot of volunteers end up becoming involved in, like, whether it's music, art, dance, they end up teaching things outside of their classroom. And so again, it doesn't matter who you are, how old you are, it's what you personally are looking to achieve in this experience. Let's see, I've got some cool photos for you, which I should say have been taken by all of our volunteers. So ladies, our panelists, Heather, Laura, do you guys have anything else to add at this time, like about just your reflection on what you took away from your time in Chile? Heather, if you want to start.
Sure. So I loved my time in Chile. Clearly I stayed longer than the initial 1 year volunteering, and I would have stayed even longer if the program that I was running at that time was continuing. But I feel like I made more families down there. I say families plural because they were in different aspects of life. For example, when I was a volunteer, I had my host family, who is now like a family to me, and I still talk to them pretty frequently. I call them on their birthdays and holidays, and they're always happy to hear from me. I'm actually going back down to visit them in January, so I'm really excited about that. It's been about a year and a half.
Nice, very nice.
Yeah, so, and then there's the family that I made in Friends that live in Santiago and up in Valparaiso, where I was placed as a volunteer, and they're just people who helped me grow as a foreigner in another country, another culture, in another experience, and people who will stay with me forever, as well as the experience. So it's something that I know I never will ever regret doing, and has kind of put me on the trajectory of what I'm doing now and where I'm going from here. So I only have good things to say about it. That's not to say that I didn't go through ups and downs, because everybody does when they live abroad for so long. And so, but I'd definitely say that the ups outweigh the downs by a million.
For sure, absolutely. Laura, before I allow you to reflect, I do have a question actually that Heather made me think of. So you've been back for 9 months now and you're working in DC. So how did your experience last year kind of lead you to your current job and perhaps help you, or what skills do you think you brought into this job that perhaps you might not have had prior?
Yeah, definitely. So, as I mentioned, my background was in Latin American politics, and I studied education in Latin American college. So it was always a big interest of mine. I was kind of going down the international development trajectory, but I wanted to improve my Spanish skills, and I wanted more broad experience to get there. So that's kind of, from a career perspective, why I decided on WorldTeach. So since coming back from WorldTeach, the experience, I applied for some positions at kind of international development think tanks or NGOs. Currently, I'm working at a domestic organization doing higher ed research just because I'm interested in the field of education. But in the future, I'm hoping to get back into more international ed stuff, international development stuff. So I know that the experience from going down to Chile will definitely help me with that, just kind of giving you the perspective and in terms of the Spanish skills. And I know that when I was applying for jobs, I wouldn't have been able to get to the interview stage at certain international jobs I was applying to if I hadn't done WorldTeach. So, I mean, I'm still kind of waiting to see how it'll translate in terms of like a career, but it's definitely something that I know will, aid me in the future. And just in terms of personal skills, I think as you were mentioning before, just kind of learning communication skills and the flexibility and just kind of developing as a person, I'm really grateful for the experience for all of those things as well.
Awesome. Fantastic. I think that in itself is a nice point of reflection. Unless there's anything else that anybody wants to add, I think this has been very productive, hopefully informative for our attendees. And again, if anybody has any questions that we haven't addressed tonight, you can definitely reach out to us here in the office. And unless there's anything else to add, I think that's it. Yeah? Okay, I'm going to take that silence as a, okay, Brooke, it's time to go home and go to bed. So thank you guys all for joining us. Best of luck with your applications or just, in this planning and research process, because as we all know from our own time abroad, it definitely takes a lot of mental planning, physical planning, research, and just time and thought. So let me see. Great. Thank you guys. I think we just got a thank you from the field. So thanks and have a great evening.
Thanks, Brooke.
Thanks.
Thanks, ladies. Good night.